The wind that came down from the Canadian border in November of 1887 did not announce itself. It arrived the way most disasters do, quietly in the night, while the settlement of Greystone Hollow was still sleeping off the last warm days of October. By dawn on the 4th, the thermometer outside Harlan Beckett's general store read 11 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 12 degrees Celsius. By noon, it hadn't moved. The sky was the color of old tin, flat and suffocating, and the birch trees along the ridge had already shed every last leaf, as if they knew what was coming and wanted no part of it. Greystone Hollow was not a large place. 43 families, most of them scratching a living from timber work and small plot farming along the eastern banks of the Crow Wing River. The cabins were solid enough: squared logs, clay-chinked walls, fieldstone chimneys, the kind of construction that passed without comment because it was simply how things were done. Every man in that valley had built his home the same way his father had, and his father before him. And every man in that valley spent the winter months doing the same exhausting arithmetic. How much wood do I have? How cold will it get? And will one survive the other? Firewood was not merely fuel in Greystone Hollow. It was time. It was sweat. It was the difference between a family that made it to March and one that didn't. Which is why, in the autumn of 1887, what one man was doing on the north end of the settlement seemed, to everyone who passed by and took a long look, like the most spectacular waste of both time and energy that the valley had ever produced. His name was Cormac Duff. He was 31 years old, a timber faller by trade, broad-shouldered and quiet in the way that men who work alone in forests tend to become quiet. He had a wife, a daughter of 4, and a cabin that sat on a low rise just above the floodplain. In that autumn, instead of stacking his firewood against the cabin wall like every other man in Greystone Hollow, Cormac Duff was digging a hole in the ground. If you've ever wondered why some of the oldest frontier cabins kept their heat longer, burned less wood, and outlasted every brutal winter on record, stay with me. Because what Cormac figured out beneath that frozen ground was not luck. It was physics. And it worked. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because every week on this channel, we pull one forgotten technique from the frontier and show you exactly why it worked, with real numbers, real materials, and real history. You won't find this in any textbook. Subscribe so you don't miss a single one. Cormac Duff had not set out to be clever. That autumn had been a bad one for timber work. A wet September had turned the logging roads into mud channels that swallowed axle hubs whole, and the mill operator 20 miles east had cut his purchasing price by nearly a third, citing a glut of supply from operations further north. Cormac had worked harder than any previous year and had less to show for it. By mid-October, his cash reserve was thin, his back was sore, and his woodpile, built over the summer months with what time he could spare between contracts, was stacked on the north side of the cabin in the usual fashion, split logs layered in rows, covered with a single sheet of pine bark thatch to shed the worst of the rain. It was his daughter, Nora, who first noticed the smell. She had gone out to fetch an armful for the evening fire and came back empty-handed, wrinkling her nose. "Duh," she said, "the wood smells like the river." Cormac went out and pulled a log from the middle of the stack. It was wet clear through, not surface damp, but saturated, the way wood gets when it has been absorbing moisture from below for weeks. He pulled another. Same thing. He crouched and looked at the base of the pile, and what he saw was simple and catastrophic. The ground beneath the stack had been slowly wicking upward through the split ends of the logs, drawn by capillary action through the grain of the wood, and 3 weeks of alternating cold nights and mild afternoons had done the rest. Nearly a third of his winter supply was compromised. Green-burning wood at best. At worst, wood that would smoke and smolder and barely produce heat at the precise moment heat was most needed. He sat on the chopping block for a long while. His wife, Vera, watched him from a window and said nothing because she understood the arithmetic as well as he did. The solution he arrived at was not born from reading. Cormac Duff was not a well-read man. It was born from a memory, a fragment of something his grandfather had described once, in passing, about how the old country Irish kept their peat stores through a wet winter. You don't stack it above the ground, the old man had said. You keep it below it. The earth itself keeps the damp out, if you know how to work with it. Cormac didn't have peat. He had split birch and tamarack. But he had a spade, and he had the better part of 3 days before the next cold snap hit. He started digging. The hole Cormac dug was not random. That is the first thing to understand. He chose the south-facing slope just below the cabin's foundation, an area of ground that received what little winter sun the valley allowed, and that sat on a natural gravel shelf, about 14 inches, 35 centimeters below the surface. Gravel drains. Gravel breathes. Where other soils hold moisture, gravel lets it pass. Cormac knew this the same way he knew which logs float and which ones sink from years of working with the land rather than against it. The pit he excavated was roughly 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 4 feet deep, approximately 2.4 m times 1.2 m times 1.2 m. Not large, deliberate. He lined the floor with flat field stones, dry laid in a single course, leaving small gaps between them to allow air to circulate from below. Over the stones he laid a raised timber floor, a simple frame of green spruce poles set 6 inches, 15 centimeters, above the stone base, creating an air gap beneath the wood storage. This gap was the key. Here is the physics, and it is not complicated. Cold air is dense. It sinks. Warm air rises. In a conventional above-ground woodpile, the coldest, dampest air settles directly against the bottom logs, the ones carrying the most moisture from ground contact. But in Cormac's underground crib, that cold air had nowhere to accumulate and stagnate. The gravel base drained any infiltrating moisture downward and away. The air gap beneath the timber floor allowed passive ventilation, a slow, invisible movement of drier air pulling through the gaps in the stone, drying the wood from below. The walls of the pit he lined with split-log planking, rough cut, yes, but fitted close enough to block the direct intrusion of surface water. He sloped the planking slightly outward at the top, so that snow melt or rain would sheet off to the sides rather than running down the interior walls. Over the top, he constructed a low roof of poles and packed sod. A lid, essentially with a small ventilation gap on the south side, kept open with a notch stick. The sod roof added thermal mass. The earth above the stored wood stayed close to the ground's ambient temperature, which, even in a Minnesota January, hovers around 32 degrees Fahrenheit to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius to 3 degrees Celsius at depth. Cold, yes, but stable. Stable cold does not cycle through the freeze-thaw-freeze pattern that destroys wood fibers and opens up grain to moisture absorption. The whole structure took 2.5 days to complete. From the outside, it looked like a low mound with a crooked stick poking out at one end. Cormac's neighbor, a Finnish carpenter named Ollie Mäkinen, walked past on his way to the mill road, stopped, stared, and walked on without saying a word, which, from Ollie Mäkinen, meant something. He would have more to say later, but that was still weeks away. Word travels fast in a small settlement when something looks strange. By the end of that first week, most of Greystone Hollow had either walked past Cormac's mound or heard about it secondhand. The reactions fell into 2 broad categories: confusion and amusement. A man named Dewey Albright, who ran a small sawmill operation 3 miles up the creek and fancied himself the closest thing the valley had to a construction authority, made his opinion known at Harlan Beckett's store on Saturday morning, loud enough for the 4 other men present to hear clearly. "Duff's buried his wood," Dewey said, setting down his coffee tin. "Like a dog buries a bone. Come spring, he'll have the finest collection of rotted timber in 3 counties. The men laughed. Not cruelly, the way men laugh when something confirms what they already suspected about the natural order of things. You stack wood above the ground. You keep it dry from above. That was the method. That was how it had always been done. Ollie Mäkinen, to his credit, said nothing during this exchange. He stood near the door and worked at a knot in his bootlace, and kept his thoughts to himself. But even Ollie, who was a careful and methodical man, had told his wife that week that Cormac was fighting the wrong enemy. The danger was rain from above, not moisture from below. That was the common understanding, and it was not entirely wrong. It was simply incomplete. The most pointed criticism came not from Dewey Albright, but from a man named Silas Horn, who operated the only proper lumber yard within 20 miles of Greystone Hollow. Silas had been in the timber business for 22 years. He had seen cabins built and cabins fail, and he had developed the particular confidence of a man whose livelihood depends on other people needing more wood than they planned for. Silas Horn looked at Cormac's mound one afternoon and said 4 words that the settlement would repeat for years afterward. "That's a grave," he said, "for wood." He wasn't trying to be poetic. He genuinely believed it. In his experience, wood stored below grade rotted. End of analysis. The idea that the specific geometry of drainage, air gap, and thermal stability could change that outcome did not fit inside his existing model, and so he discarded it without further examination. Cormac heard the comment through Vera, who had heard it from the blacksmith's wife. He didn't respond. He went back out to the mound, checked the ventilation gap, adjusted the notched stick a 1/4 inch, and went inside for supper. He had done what he could. Now it was the winter's turn. The cold came in earnest on the 22nd of January, 1888. Meteorological record from the region, preserved in part by the Crow Wing County Agricultural Survey, conducted years later, described the winter of 1887 to 88 as one of the most sustained freeze events in the recorded history of central Minnesota. But it was the January stretch that broke people. For 19 consecutive days, the temperature in the Greystone Hollow Valley did not rise above 4 degrees Fahrenheit minus 16 degrees Celsius. On the worst 3 days, it dropped to minus 26 degrees Fahrenheit minus 32 degrees Celsius before midnight. The wind came from a northwest and didn't quit. It found every gap in every chinked wall, and it took the heat from a room the way a thief takes silver, quietly, steadily, and completely. By the end of the first week of that freeze, the Firewood situation in Greystone Hollow had become what polite company called a concern and what honest men called a crisis. The problem was not shortage. Most families had stacked enough volume. The problem was quality. 3 weeks of freeze-thaw cycling before the hard cold arrived had done its work on the valley's above-ground wood piles. The outer layers were fine, cold and dry, preserved by the very temperatures that had locked the valley in ice. But the inner rows, the ones that had been absorbing ground moisture since October and had gone through repeated partial thaws, were wet. Not soaking, but wet enough. Wet enough to burn cold. Wet enough to produce the dense, rolling smoke that told you the wood was fighting the fire rather than feeding it. Wet enough to cut a fire's heat output by 30% or more, which meant burning more wood to achieve less warmth, which meant running through supplies faster than the arithmetic had planned for. Dewey Albright burned through his estimated 2-month reserve in 31 days. He was not careless. He had simply stacked his wood the standard way, on the north side of his cabin, directly on bare ground, covered with pine bark thatch. The bottom third of his pile had been compromised since late October. He hadn't known it until January showed him the bill. Stay with me, because the number that came out of the next 2 weeks is the one that silenced Silas Horn completely. And once you hear it, you'll never look at a wood pile the same way again. If this kind of history is something you want more of, hit subscribe right now. Every week, one real technique, one real story, one real winter that proved who was right. Don't miss it. It was Ollie Mackinnon who first noticed. He had not been looking for evidence. He had been looking for Cormac, wanting to borrow a draw knife to repair a broken sled runner. And when he came around the north side of the cabin, he saw something that stopped him where he stood. Cormac was crouched at the entrance of the mound, pulling split birch logs from the underground crib with the unhurried ease of a man reaching into a pantry. The wood came out clean, pale yellow at the split faces, dry to the touch, the way freshly milled lumber feels on a warm July afternoon. Not the gray, fiber-softened surface of wood that has been fighting cold and moisture for 3 months. Ollie stood there a moment without speaking. Then he reached out and took one of the logs from the stack Cormac had set aside. He turned it in his hands, tapped the end grain with one knuckle. The knock was sharp and resonant, the sound of wood with low moisture content, wood that would catch fast and burn long and clean. "How much you got left?" Ollie asked. Cormac looked at the crib, made a quiet calculation. "About 2/3, he said. Ollie said nothing more that afternoon. But he was thinking, and what he was thinking was this. His own wood pile, stacked the standard way, was below half, and his cabin ran cold. The comparison that emerged over the following 2 weeks was not conducted with instruments. There was no thermometer mounted to Cormac's interior wall, no formal ledger of daily wood consumption. What existed were the practical observations of neighbors living through the same 19-day freeze in adjacent cabins. And those observations, recorded years later in the Crow Wing County Agricultural Survey, as collected oral testimony, told a consistent story. Cormac Duff's cabin held an interior temperature of approximately 54 degrees Fahrenheit to 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius to 14 degrees Celsius, during the worst nights of the January freeze, burning roughly 1 cord of wood per month. The settlement average, based on accounts from 6 neighboring households, ran between 34 degrees Fahrenheit and 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius to 5 degrees Celsius, overnight, with several families reporting that water in their kitchen pails developed a skim of ice before dawn. Those same households were burning through wood at rates between 1.5 to 2 cords per month, the excess consumption driven almost entirely by the reduced heat output of compromised high-moisture fuel. Put plainly, Cormac's cabin ran approximately 15 degrees Fahrenheit to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, 8 degrees Celsius to 11 degrees Celsius, warmer at night than the settlement average, and did it on roughly half the wood. The mechanism was not magic. Dry wood ignites faster, reaches combustion temperature sooner, and sustains a cleaner, hotter burn. A seasoned birch log with moisture content below 20% releases nearly its full thermal potential to the firebox. A log carrying 35% or more moisture, which is what wet stack wood commonly runs after a compromised autumn, spends a significant portion of its energy evaporating that internal water before it can produce usable heat. The firebox gets a fraction of the BTUs it should. The room stays cold. The family burns more wood trying to compensate. The cycle feeds itself. Cormac's underground crib had kept his wood's moisture content stable across the entire autumn and early winter. The gravel base and raised timber floor had blocked upward capillary wicking. The sod roof and close-fitted log walls had eliminated the freeze-thaw cycling that opens wood grain to surface absorption. The ventilation gap on the south face had maintained slow, passive airflow, enough to carry away any residual humidity without allowing the cold wind to chill the stored wood below the dew point and trigger condensation on the surfaces. The result? Wood that burned the way wood is supposed to burn. Not a miracle, a deliberate management of conditions. 2 numbers stuck in the valley's memory after that winter, passed from household to household until they became something close to local scripture. The first, 20 degrees warmer at night. The second, half the wood. Neither figure was exact. They were the rounded language of men who measured things in cords and frostbite, not laboratory decimals. But they were real, and everyone in Greystone Hollow understood what they meant. Silas Horn heard the numbers on a Thursday morning, standing in his own lumber yard. He didn't respond immediately. He picked up a piece of split tamarack, looked at it, set it back down. Then he walked to the far end of the yard and began tallying inventory, which was what Silas Horn did when he needed time to revise his thinking without appearing to revise it. The spring thaw came in late March, as it always did, washing the worst of the winter out of the valley with a week of gray drizzle and snowmelt that turned every low trail into a shallow creek. Cormac opened his underground crib in the first week of April to assess what remained. He pulled out the last of the stored wood, still sound, still dry, the bottom layers in particular showing no rot, no softening, no gray surface oxidation, and stacked it beside the cabin for what remained of the shoulder season cold. Then he walked the perimeter of the pit, examined the drainage, checked the sod roof for frost heave, and made a mental note of 2 small adjustments he would make before the next autumn. He was not thinking about legacy. He was thinking about whether to widen the ventilation gap by half an inch. But Greystone Hollow was thinking about something else entirely. Ollie Mackinnon came by in the second week of April with a list of questions that he had clearly been composing for months. How deep was the gravel bed? How far above the stone base did the timber floor sit? How had Cormac pitched the sod roof? Flat, or with a slight lean to the south? He asked each question carefully, the way a carpenter asks questions, wanting the dimension before he commits to the cut. Cormac answered each one without impatience, drawing rough proportions in the mud with a stick when words weren't sufficient. By midsummer of 1888, Ollie had built his own version of the underground wood crib, slightly larger, with a heavier sod roof and a dual ventilation gap, one on the south face and one on the east, to improve cross-draft in the warmer months. He showed it to his neighbor, a man named Fletcher Goss, who built a third version before September. The adoption was not announced. There was no town meeting, no formal endorsement, no reversal of public position. It happened the way practical things happen in practical communities, quietly, individually, and entirely on the basis of results. One man saw the numbers. He built the thing. Another man saw his numbers. He built his version. The idea moved through the valley the way heat moves through stone. Not in a rush, but steadily, and once it was in, it stayed. Dewey Albright, who had made the remark about Cormac burying his wood like a dog buries a bone, did not build an underground crib that year. He did, however, raise his above-ground wood pile onto a platform of split-log sleepers, 6 inches off the ground, and covered the base with a gravel border to improve drainage. He did not mention Cormac's name when describing this modification to anyone. He did not need to. The valley understood. Silas Horne adapted more slowly and more deliberately. By the winter of 1889-90, he had incorporated a version of the subgrade wood storage into the design of the small outbuilding behind his lumber yard, where he kept his premium kiln-dried stock. The boards he charged extra for because they were guaranteed low moisture. He told a customer that winter that the technique was based on sound drainage principles. It was the closest Silas Horne ever came to a public acknowledgement. The Crow Wing County Agricultural Survey, conducted in 1893, documented 17 homesteads within a 40-mile radius of Greystone Hollow that had incorporated some form of subgrade or partially earthen firewood storage into their winter preparation. The survey noted, in dry bureaucratic language, that these homesteads consistently reported lower fuel consumption and fewer complaints of incomplete combustion during sustained cold periods. It did not mention Cormac Duff by name. Oral accounts gathered decades later filled in that gap. By then, Cormac had already built a second crib, larger, refined, with a stone-lined drainage channel that ran 12 feet, 3.6 meters, downslope to a gravel dispersion bed. His daughter Nora, who had been the one to smell the wet wood that October morning in 1887, would later describe her father's reaction to the community's gradual adoption of his method as quiet and uncomplicated. He didn't say much about it, she recalled, according to a family account preserved in county records. He just said the ground already knew how to do it. He only had to ask it right. There's a particular kind of knowledge that does not come from books. It comes from a cold morning and a compromised woodpile and a daughter wrinkling her nose at the smell of wet birch. It comes from a half-remembered story told by a grandfather who had never set foot in Minnesota about peat and old country earth and the way the ground holds things steady when everything above it is in chaos. It comes from a man with a spade and 3 days and a gravel shelf 14 inches below the frost line. Cormac Duff was not an engineer. He did not know the terms thermal mass, vapor barrier, passive ventilation, hygroscopic equilibrium. He did not need to know the terms. He understood the principles in the way that people who live close to the land understand principles, not as abstractions, but as consequences. Wet wood burns cold. Cold burns more wood. More wood means more labor, more time, more exposure. So, keep the wood dry. And to keep the wood dry, understand what is making it wet. Not the rain from above, which everyone was already managing, but the moisture from below, which no one had bothered to think about, because thinking about it required looking at the problem from a different angle. That is the piece that the Dewey Albrights and Silas Hornes of Greystone Hollow had missed. Not the solution, the angle. They had inherited a method that addressed one vector of moisture and assumed it addressed all of them. Cormac, by accident of a ruined woodpile and an old man's story, was forced to look at the problem whole. And when he did, the solution was not complicated. It was just dirt, stone, air, and geometry. The frontier was full of this kind of knowledge. Not primitive knowledge. That word implies a lesser thing, and this was not a lesser thing. It was knowledge earned under conditions that did not permit error. When your margin for the winter is a cord and a half of wood and a stone chimney and a clay chinked wall, you cannot afford to be wrong. The settlers who survived the long Minnesota winters were not surviving on stubbornness alone. They were surviving on a continuous, ruthless accumulation of practical understanding. Understanding of materials, of microclimate, of the specific behavior of cold and moisture and fire in the specific geography where they lived. That knowledge was not always recognized as knowledge. It was often dismissed as habit or accident, or the quirky stubbornness of a particular man. It was laughed at by carpenters in general stores. It was called a grave for wood. And then the winter came, and the wood stayed dry, and the fire burned clean and long and hot at half the consumption rate of every other cabin in the valley, and the laughter stopped. It always stops. The techniques that emerged from places like Greystone Hollow, subgrade wood storage, gravel-based drainage, passive ventilation gaps, sod insulation, were not invented from scratch by Cormac Duff or anyone like him. Variations of earth and food and fuel storage appear across cultures and centuries. The Irish turf pit, the Scandinavian root cellar, the Plains Indian cache pit, the Russian zemlyanka. What men like Cormac did was apply the underlying logic to a specific problem in a specific place under specific pressure. That is what the frontier demanded, and that is what the frontier produced. The earth is a thermal buffer. Below the frost line, its temperature is stable. Stable temperature means no freeze-thaw cycling. No freeze-thaw cycling means intact wood grain. Intact wood grain means low moisture absorption. Low moisture absorption means dry wood. Dry wood means a clean, efficient fire. A clean, efficient fire means warmth, and warmth in a Minnesota January is not comfort. It is survival. Cormac Duff understood this not because he was exceptional, but because he was paying attention, and that perhaps is the oldest survival skill of all. If this story made you think differently about how your ancestors kept warm, drop a comment below. Tell us, where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? We read every single one, and if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Every week, one real technique, one real story, one real winter that proved who was right. Hit that button. We'll see you next week. Educational and historical content only. This script is a narrative reconstruction based on regional frontier practices and plausible oral accounts. It does not substitute for professional engineering, construction, fire safety, or building code guidance. Always consult qualified professionals and local regulations before undertaking any structural project.